The night Dominic Raso put a bullet through his own reflection, nobody in the penthouse moved. Not the two men posted near the elevator with their hands folded and their faces blank. Not Marcus Webb, his head of security, who had been present for things that would end careers and ended men, and who had learned 14 years ago that stillness was the only appropriate response to Dominic in this particular frequency of rage. And not the woman moving quietly through the dining room, collecting the plates from a dinner that had never been touched, who heard the shot, pressed her back flat against the wall, counted to 5 the way she always did, and kept clearing the table. She was good at counting through the sounds. It was how she had survived this house for 3 years. And Dominic stood in the center of his living room with his phone in his hand and a name on the screen that had stopped making sense and then made terrible, complete sense all at once. Natasha. The woman he had brought into his home, his bed, the one room in his empire where he had allowed himself, against every instinct his father had beaten into him, to be something other than careful. She had not just betrayed him. She had done it slowly, deliberately, over 8 months, feeding case files and wire routes and names to the FBI with a smile on her face while she told him he was different from the men she had known before. She was already in federal custody before he had finished reading the first paragraph of the briefing, gone before he could make a single call. "Find out who else knew," he said. His voice was not loud. It never was. And when it mattered. Marcus nodded once and left the room without a sound. Dominic walked to the window. 40 floors of Chicago between him and the street below, all that glass and distance, all that cold, and still she had gotten close enough to take something. Not the operation details. Those were recoverable. What she had taken was the specific, buried, almost extinguished part of him that had decided, one more time, to believe that proximity did not always end in damage. He pressed his forehead to the glass and said nothing at all. In the dining room, Camille Brooks stacked the last of the plates, lifted them carefully, and carried them to the kitchen without making a sound. She had heard everything. She heard the gunshot. She heard the silence that came after it, which was somehow larger than the shot itself. And she heard him at the window not speaking, which was the worst sound of all, because she had learned in 3 years of working in this house that Dominic Raso's silences were not empty. They were full of things he would never let anyone carry with him. She set the plates in the sink. She turned on the faucet. She told herself it was none of her business. She had been telling herself that for 3 years. Camille Brooks had come to the Raso penthouse from the South Side, placed by an agency that asked no questions and paid better than anywhere else she had applied. She was 27 years old, precise, and in possession of one skill that had made her indispensable in a house like this. She knew how to be invisible. She had practiced it carefully from her first week, when she watched a man leave Dominic's private office walking like someone had rearranged his internal architecture and understood without being told exactly what kind of household this was. She kept her eyes down. She learned his schedule, his preferences, the exact weight of his silence at different hours of the night. She did her work. She did not ask questions. She did not feel things. That last part had been quietly breaking for about 2 years. The most dangerous thing in his penthouse had never been the gun. It had been her, quietly, faithfully, all along. And in 72 hours, a medical folder on his desk was going to make that the most complicated truth either of them had ever had to live with. If this opening already has you feeling something, hit that like button right now and subscribe. Because what Dominic says to Camille in that office will stop you cold, and what she says back will make you love her forever. Stay with us. This story is just getting started. The night Dominic Raso emptied a full glass of scotch against the wall of his penthouse, nobody in the room flinched. Not the two men posted near the elevator with their hands folded and their faces arranged into the careful blankness of people who had learned, through various instructive experiences, that stillness was the only safe response to this particular frequency of rage. Not Marcus Webb, his head of security, who had watched Dominic put a knife through a man's hand at 17 and had spent the 14 years since cataloging far worse, and who stood now near the window with his eyes forward and his expression neutral, the way a man stands when he has decided that whatever is happening is not his to interrupt. And not the woman moving quietly through the dining room, clearing a dinner that had never been touched, collecting plates one by one with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned to make herself invisible, who heard the crack of crystal against marble, pressed herself flat against the wall, and waited for the storm to pass the way she always did. She was good at waiting. She had been doing it for 3 years. The penthouse occupied the 40th floor of a building on East Lakeshore Drive that cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides, furniture that was chosen to impress and succeeded. The view of Lake Michigan that on clear nights looked less like water and more like the edge of the known world. It was the kind of space that announced, without apology, the precise distance between the man who lived here and everyone who didn't. Dominic Raso had inherited the Raso family at 26, when his father took 3 bullets in a steakhouse on Rush Street and did not survive the appetizers. He had spent the 5 years since consolidating, expanding, and defending an empire built on fear and the specific load-bearing loyalty that only fear reliably produces. He was 31 years old. He was, by most measurable accounts, the most dangerous man in Chicago. He had never, in 5 years of running the organization, allowed anyone close enough to use that proximity against him. Until Natasha. He stood at the center of the room with his phone in his hand and a briefing on the screen that had stopped making sense and then made terrible, complete sense all at once. 8 months. She had been feeding case files, wire routes, and names to a federal task force for 8 months. From inside his home, from inside his bed, with a smile on her face and his trust in her hands like a gift she had already decided what to do with. She was in federal protective custody before he had finished reading the first page. Gone before he could make a single call. Vanished so cleanly it confirmed she had been planning the exit as carefully as she had planned everything else. He had not lost money. Money was recoverable. What she had taken was the small, specific, a deeply inconvenient part of him that had decided, against every lesson his father had ever taught him, against every instinct 14 years in this life had built, to believe that one person was different. "Find out who else knew," he said. His voice was level. It was always level when it mattered. "Everything. Everyone." Marcus nodded once and left the room without a sound. Dominic walked to the window. 40 floors of Chicago between him and the street. All that glass, all that distance, all that cold. And still she had gotten close enough to reach something. He pressed his forehead against the glass and said nothing at all. In the dining room, Camille Brooks stacked the last plate, lifted the pile carefully, and carried it to the kitchen without making a sound. She set everything in the sink. She turned on the faucet. And she looked at the water running over her hands and told herself, quietly and firmly, that none of this was her business. She had been telling herself that for 3 years. Outside, Chicago moved through its night, indifferent and luminous and entirely unconcerned. Behind her, down the hall, the most dangerous man in the city stood at a window coming undone in the specific silence of a person who had no one to come undone in front of. The only person who noticed was the woman he had never once thought to look at. The 72 hours that followed were the quietest Camille had ever known the penthouse to be. Not quiet like empty, quiet like held breath, like a building that had decided, collectively and without discussion, to move carefully around something that had not yet been named. Dominic's men felt it first. She could tell by the way they communicated in shorter sentences, positioned themselves closer to walls, kept their eyes tracking without appearing to track. Men who worked for Dominic Raso developed a particular sensitivity to his atmospheric pressure. When it dropped, you adjusted. You did not ask why. Camille noticed different things. She noticed that his coffee went cold on the counter Tuesday morning. She had left it at 7:15, his usual time, and when she came back at 7:45, it had not moved. She poured it out and made a fresh cup without comment. That one went cold, too. She noticed that he did not come to the dining room for dinner Tuesday night or Wednesday, and that when she left a covered plate in the kitchen at 9 p.m., it was exactly where she had left it when she came in at 6 a.m. And she noticed that he stood at the window longer than the view deserved. Not the restless pacing of a man working through a problem, but the stillness of a man who had already arrived at an answer he did not particularly want. She filed all of it carefully and said nothing because that was what she did. On Thursday evening, Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. "He wants to see you. His office." She dried her hands, straightened her apron. Followed. She had been called to Dominic's office perhaps a dozen times in 3 years. It was always logistical, a schedule adjustment, an instruction about an incoming guest, something about the household that required direct communication rather than a note. She expected something logistical now. What she got was a medical folder on the desk. Northwestern Memorial letterhead. Dr. Elaine Park. Oncology. The tab at the top read Raso, Dominic A., and below that a date from 6 days ago and a string of clinical language she could read from where she stood without being invited to read it. Dominic was in the leather chair behind the desk. He was watching her the way he watched things he was calculating how to handle. "Sit down, Camille." She sat. He told her about the diagnosis the way he discussed everything. Level, unhurried, no performance of feeling in any direction. Stage 4 lymphoma. Aggressive presentation. Treatment options existed, but the window was not wide and the odds were not comfortable. He had known for 6 days. He had told no one. Then he told her why he was telling her now. His lawyers required a named heir. The Raso family. 3 generations of it. Everything his grandfather had built from nothing, and his father had bled to expand, and he had spent 5 years holding together with both hands, did not end with him. He would not allow it to end with him. He slid a second folder across the desk. "I'm proposing a contract marriage, legal, documented, airtight. You become my wife. We have a child. In exchange, you and that child are provided for, completely, permanently, financially, legally, with the full weight of everything I own and everything that owns me behind you." A pause. Just one. "Nobody in this city touches you. Not ever." The office was very still. Camille looked at the folder. She looked at his face. That face she had been carefully not looking at for 2 years. She picked up the folder, set it back down, stood. "Yo, may I have some time to think about it?" Her voice did not shake. She was extraordinarily proud of that. "Take the weekend," he said. She walked out without turning around. She did not want him to see her face. Her room was at the end of the staff hallway, small, clean, hers. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands over her face and stayed like that for a long time. Dominic Raso was dying. Dominic Raso had just asked her to have his child. She had been in love with this man in complete, disciplined, mortifying silence for 2 years. She had never said a word, had never intended to say a word, had built an entire internal architecture around never saying a word. She did not know whether to laugh or to weep. She did both, quietly, into her palms. While Chicago moved in differently 40 floors below, and the most dangerous man she had ever known sat alone in his office in the dark. She had made her decision by Friday night. She spent Saturday letting herself sit with it anyway, not because she was uncertain, but because she was the kind of person who believed that decisions this large deserved at least the dignity of a full night's sleep before you acted on them. She lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and thought about her mother on the south side, who would have questions Camille was not yet prepared to answer. She thought about the contract folder and the 11 pages she had read 4 times. She thought about a man eating cold pasta alone at midnight and the question she had never stopped asking herself since. Who takes care of you? Sunday morning she was up at 6. She showered, dressed, and left the building at 7. She took the 151 bus down Michigan Avenue to the coffee place, the one with the green awning and the line that was always too long and the particular dark roast that Dominic took black with no sugar and that she had been ordering on his behalf for 3 years. She knew his order the way she knew the rest of it. Quietly, without having been asked. She was back at the penthouse at 5 to 8. She walked to his office door. Knocked once. Come in. He was already at his desk, suit jacket on, documents open. He looked up when she entered, and something moved through his expression. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. She crossed the room and set the coffee in front of him without a word. Then she said, "One condition." He waited. "Full treatment. Everything, doctor. Park has recommended. Every session, every protocol. You don't negotiate it down, and you don't decide quietly on your own that something isn't worth the effort." She held his gaze. "You don't give up before you try." The silence lasted 4 seconds. She counted. Something moved across his face, too fast and too unguarded to name before he put it back where it belonged. "Agreed," he said. She nodded once. "Then yes." The contract was 11 pages. She read every word of it twice, alone at the kitchen table on Monday morning with a legal dictionary open on her phone and a pen in her hand. She initialed 7 pages and signed the last one. Her handwriting was very steady. She was quietly amazed by that. The ceremony was on a Wednesday, at a civil registry office on Clark Street that smelled like recycled air and institutional carpet. But there were 2 witnesses. Marcus, who stood beside Dominic in a dark suit with the expression of a man being ambushed by emotions he had not budgeted for and was handling by staring at a fixed point on the wall, and a lawyer named Greaves, who had the demeanor of someone who had witnessed everything twice and retained nothing. Camille wore a white dress she had bought herself, off a rack, $54. It fit well. It was not a wedding dress. This was not that kind of day. Dominic wore a dark suit and looked exactly the way he always looked, composed, unreadable, and devastating in a way she needed, with some urgency, to stop noticing. The officiant asked him if he took her as his wife. He said yes in the same voice he used to close contracts across conference tables. Efficient, final. The officiant asked Camille, but she looked at the clean line of his jaw. She thought about 11 pages and Friday night and the question she had been asking for 2 years. "Yes," she said, in a voice that did not shake. She was deeply, privately proud of that. He did not kiss her. The civil ceremony did not require it. They signed the register and walked out into a gray Wednesday afternoon as husband and wife, and she was still calling him Mr. Raso in her head, and nothing about this was what anyone would call romantic, and everything was exactly as it should be. Dinner that night was quiet in the particular way that new things are quiet, not comfortable, not unbearable, something uncertain and suspended in between. He read documents at the head of the table. She ate and kept her eyes on her plate and was very careful not to look at him too often. Though when she stood to clear the table and said good night, he looked up from his papers. The food was good. She very nearly walked into the doorframe. "Thank you," she said, and went to her room and closed the door behind her and leaned against it and stood in the dark for a full minute. She told herself, with great firmness, that it meant nothing. She told herself that for a long time before she finally believed it enough to sleep. Treatment started on a Monday. 3 sessions a week, Northwestern Memorial, 8th floor oncology. The kind of schedule that reorganized a life around itself whether you wanted it to or not. Dominic went to the first one alone. Camille found out from Marcus at 9 a.m., 20 minutes after the car had already pulled out of the garage. That Marcus mentioned it the way he mentioned things he suspected she would want to know but hadn't been authorized to tell her, sideways while looking at something else. Something moved through her chest. Cold and specific. She did not name it. She put it where she put the other things and went back to work. The second session was Thursday. She was already in the car when he came down. He stopped at the passenger door, looked at her through the window with an expression that was not quite confusion and not quite irritation, but lived somewhere between them. He got in. The door closed. The driver pulled into traffic. Neither of them spoke. He did not thank her. He did not tell her to leave. He opened his tablet and began working before they had cleared the block. And she opened the book in her lap and looked at the same paragraph for 11 minutes and absorbed none of it. She attended every session after that. The rhythm of it settled into something almost ordinary within 2 weeks. Dominic in the infusion chair with his tablet, running operations from an oncology ward with the same focused efficiency he brought to every other room he occupied. Her in the chair beside him, book open, watching his face in her peripheral vision for the things he would never consciously show. The tightening around his eyes when the medication hit. The moment around the 90-minute mark when the energy he spent maintaining his composure became visibly expensive. She never commented. He never acknowledged that she was watching. They had reached, without discussing it, a functional understanding of how to be in this together. At home, proximity did what proximity always does. He was there more. Doctor's orders reduced his hours at the office, which meant he was in the penthouse during the hours she had always had quietly to herself. He worked at the dining table. He took calls at the window. He appeared in the kitchen at odd hours looking for things she had already placed within arm's reach, because she had learned in 3 years exactly where he would look first. She began doing her own tasks in the same rooms, not by decision, just by the slow, unremarkable gravity of 2 people who were no longer simply occupying the same building, but actually sharing it. It was a Tuesday evening when she caught herself humming. An old song, her grandmother's church, South Side. Had the kind of melody that lived so deep in the body you didn't know it was coming out until it already had. She was at the stove, back to the doorway, and she had been humming for probably a full minute before she heard him stop. She turned. Dominic was in the doorway. He was not reading anything. He was not on a call. He was just standing there, watching her with an expression she had no framework for, open in some way that his face almost never was, like a door left ajar by accident. He said nothing. After a moment, he moved to the counter, poured water, and left. Neither of them spoke about it. The call from his mother came on a Friday. Camille was at the kitchen island chopping vegetables when she heard his voice drop into the particular register he used for conversations that required management. She was not trying to listen, and the penthouse did not always cooperate with that intention. She heard the words the maid delivered with a precision that was not accidental. A careful woman, Dominic Raso, the kind who knew exactly how far a phrase could travel. Camille kept chopping, even strokes, eyes on the board. She did not let her hands change speed. Driving back from treatment that Thursday, the city blurring past rain-streaked windows, Dominic said, quietly, almost to himself, "You don't have to keep coming." Camille looked at the road ahead. "I know." Silence. Then why? She considered the question honestly. Outside, Chicago moved past in gray and amber and glass. "Because nobody should sit in that chair alone." He said nothing, but she felt it. Something small, something almost imperceptible, like a lock turning in a door that had not been opened in a very long time. If this story is doing something to you, if Camille and Dominic are already living in your chest a little, hit subscribe and stay with us. Because what happens next will make everything you just listened feel like the calm before the storm. You do not want to miss it. Vivian Raso arrived on a Saturday morning with one piece of luggage, a woman Camille did not recognize who carried it, and the specific composure of someone who had decided before walking through the door exactly how this visit would go. She was elegant in the way that certain kinds of money produce. Not flashy, not warm, just precise. Cream silk blouse, hair set perfectly. The kind of beauty that had hardened over decades into something that no longer needed to be admired and had become instead simply a feature of her authority. She kissed Dominic on the cheek. She looked at Camille once, briefly, the way you look at furniture you are considering having reupholstered. Within 20 minutes, Camille understood the parameters. It happened at the kitchen counter. Camille was preparing coffee. She had been preparing coffee in this penthouse for 3 years, and she was very good at it. When Vivian appeared beside her and said, without looking at her, "You can take those cups to the sitting room when you're done." A pause, delicate and precise as a blade. "That will be all." Dominic was 6 feet away at the dining table. He did not look up from his documents. Camille finished making the coffee. She carried the cups to the sitting room. She set them on the table with steady hands and walked back to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment with the water running and her eyes on the middle distance. Then she dried her hands and finished what she had been doing. That evening, she did not come to the sitting room. She stayed in her room with the door closed and a book she did not read open in her lap, and she let the kitchen stay quiet for the first time in 3 years. No dinner, no covered plate left on the counter. Nothing. She was not making a point. She simply had nothing left over that evening for the performance of normalcy. An hour passed. She heard footsteps in the hallway, unhurried, distinctive. They stopped outside her door. She looked at it. A long moment. And she could feel him on the other side of it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Something present and unresolved. He did not knock. After a while, the footsteps retreated, and the penthouse was quiet again, and Camille looked back at her book and read the same sentence 4 times. The meeting happened on Tuesday. She was not supposed to know about it. She knew about it anyway, the way she had always known about things in this house. Not because anyone told her, but because 3 years of invisibility had made her fluent in the language of lowered voices and closed doors and the specific tension that gathered in a room before something significant was decided. She heard enough. 2 of Dominic's lieutenants. The word compromised used carefully, more than once. His illness referenced in the way men reference things they are testing the weight of, pressing to see if it holds. The marriage mentioned, the maid again, that phrase doing its work, as evidence of a larger instability, an invitation, quiet and deniable, for someone to consider whether the current arrangement was sustainable. She set down the glass she was holding and walked back to the kitchen and did not say a word to anyone. What happened after the meeting she did not witness. She knew something had happened by Wednesday afternoon. By the way Marcus's posture recalibrated, by the way the younger men in the hallway found reasons to face the wall when Dominic walked past, by the absence at Thursday's meeting of one of the 2 men she had heard on Tuesday. Dominic said nothing about it. He did not need to. And that had always been the most frightening thing about him. Not what he said, but the size of what he didn't. He came into the kitchen at 1 a.m. and found her there. She was not waiting for him. She had simply wanted tea and had not been able to sleep, and the kitchen had always been, even in this penthouse, the room that felt most like hers. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then he came in and sat at the island. She made coffee without being asked, his, black, the temperature he preferred, and poured her tea and sat across from him, and they were quiet together in a way that was, for the first time, a choice, rather than simply the absence of conversation. The city glowed beyond the windows. The penthouse held its breath. When he spoke, it was not about his mother. It was not about the meeting or the men or the machinery of everything she had overheard. I should have said something, he said. When she spoke to you that way. Camille looked at her cup. The tea was still too hot to drink. You should have, she said. A pause, small and clean and honest. I know. It was the closest he had come to an apology in years. She suspected he knew that. She suspected that was why he had come to the kitchen at 1 a.m. and sat down without being invited. Because there are things that are easier to say across a counter in the dark than they are to say anywhere else. She did not make it easy for him, but she did not make it harder than it needed to be. They finished their drinks, they said goodnight, they went to their separate rooms. But something had shifted, quietly, in the architecture of the house. And something that had not been there on Saturday morning. She tracked it for a week before she said anything. The pattern had reassembled itself quietly, the way Dominic's patterns always did. Not announced, just suddenly present. 2 a.m. 3. Once, on a Thursday when he had a treatment session the following morning, closer to 4. She noted the medication timing slipping. She noted the coffee going cold again. She said nothing and watched and told herself she was simply gathering information, which was what she always told herself, and which was becoming increasingly difficult to believe. On Tuesday, she sat down at the kitchen island at 11 p.m. with a cup of coffee and waited. By 2:47 a.m., the coffee was cold, and she had not moved. She heard the elevator at 2:51. He came through the door already loosening his collar and stopped when he saw her. The penthouse was dark except for the kitchen light. Outside, Chicago glittered at full indifferent brightness. She did not do the careful thing. 3 years of careful dissolved somewhere between the elevator sound and this moment, and she did not retrieve it. You are in treatment. Her voice was quiet. Not loud. She had never been loud. But it carried everything she had been not saying for a week. Your body needs rest to have any chance at this. Your medication has a window and you have been missing it for 6 days. She looked at him across the island. And you are out until 3 in the morning like you have not got a single thing worth coming home to. The silence that followed was enormous, and the specific kind that forms when something true has been said in a room that wasn't ready for it. Then Dominic's voice dropped into that register, the one she had heard used on men who did not get a second chance to hear it. My life, he said. My choices. She did not flinch. Our child, she said. My husband. My life, too, whether you architected it that way or not. She held his gaze. So yes, it is my business. She stood. She walked to her room. She closed the door behind her with a soft, controlled click. Not a slam, she would not give him a slam. And stood inside it with both hands pressed flat against her face. She had just said all of that to Dominic Raso. She stood in the dark and oscillated between complete horror and something that felt, embarrassingly and unmistakably, like relief. Like something that had been held underwater for a very long time had finally been allowed to surface and breathe. She did not sleep well. She suspected he didn't either. Morning. She came out prepared for frost, the specific, weaponized silence she had seen him deploy against men who had crossed him far less thoroughly than she had the night before. He was at the counter with coffee, dressed, calm. She moved to the far cabinet and reached for the shelf above the stove. It was too high. She stretched. Her fingers fell short. A hand reached past her, unhurried, close, and set the container on the counter in front of her. She turned. He was closer than she had registered. Neither of them moved. I'm sorry, she said. I'm sorry, he said, at exactly the same moment. They looked at each other. Something cracked open in the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just the specific quiet sound of two people accidentally being human at precisely the same time. You were right, he said. I have been avoiding coming back. I did not know how to exist in this arrangement. A pause. and in it something unguarded. "I will come home earlier." She nodded, looked at her counter. He picked up his coffee, paused with his back half turned. "You can call me Dominic," he said. "I won't tell you again." She looked at him, tested the word carefully, like stepping onto ice she wasn't sure would hold. "Dominic." He nodded once, left the kitchen. She stood holding her coffee cup, feeling like the floor had shifted 2 inches to the left and had no immediate plans to shift back. She told him on a Tuesday morning, no preamble. She simply set the test on the kitchen counter in front of him and waited. She had braced herself for several possible versions of Dominic Raso receiving this information. The controlled nod, the immediate pivot to logistics, the careful neutrality he deployed when something mattered too much to acknowledge directly. She had not braced herself for what actually happened, which was that his face opened, completely, without defense, like a window thrown wide in a room that had been sealed for years. He looked at the test. He looked at her. He pulled her in without a word and held on, and in the silence she felt everything he was carrying. The love and the terror, and at the edges of both of them, quiet and patient, the grief that never fully left him. He said nothing for a long time. She let him say nothing. It was enough. The 3 weeks that followed were the warmest the penthouse had ever been. He attended every appointment. He learned the stages, the terminology, asked Dr. Okafor questions that revealed he had done significant reading beforehand. She found the evidence of that reading on a Thursday. A medical textbook on fetal development sitting on the corner of his office desk, 3 pages marked with small yellow tabs, his handwriting in the margins asking questions the appointments hadn't yet answered. She stood in the doorway of his office and looked at it for a long moment. She did not tell him she had seen it. The expression it put on her face was not one she was ready to explain. She went to Northwestern on a Wednesday for a routine follow-up. Blood work, nothing significant. At an appointment Dominic had noted in his calendar and offered to attend, and she had told him wasn't necessary. Dr. Park was coming out of a consultation room when she turned the corner. He saw her. Something happened in his expression, a rapid, involuntary rearrangement of a man who has just understood he is standing at the edge of an error he cannot walk back. "Mrs. Raso, careful, measured. I assumed you'd been informed after last week's results." She had not been informed of anything. She drove home. Dominic was at the dining table when she walked in. He looked up. He saw her face. She watched it happen. The precise, almost imperceptible calculation behind his eyes as he assessed what she knew and determined in the span of 2 seconds that denial was no longer a viable position. His expression did not change, but something behind it did. "The treatment has lost ground," she said. Her voice was very steady. "The cancer has accelerated. You have known for 3 weeks." He said nothing. "I go to every session." The steadiness was costing her. "I rearrange everything around your schedule, your medication, your rest. I sit in that chair beside you 3 days a week, and I watch your face and I tell myself we are doing everything right." A breath. "And you sat across from me every single day and said nothing." Her voice cracked on the last word. She hated it. "I have never asked you for anything." She pressed her hands together. "I am asking you now. Do not lie to me. Not about this. I deserve better than this." He crossed the room. She stepped back. He stopped. "You're right. No argument, no deflection. Just that. I was wrong. I am not accustomed to letting people carry things with me." A pause, stripped of everything except honesty. "It is not an excuse. It is an explanation. I am sorry." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he would know she had heard it. Then she walked to her room and closed the door. He did not follow. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and pressed both hands over her mouth and stayed very still. Down the hall, she knew. He was sitting at the dining table in the dark, too. Neither of them slept much that night. She was civil. She was present. She was professional in every measurable way. She was also completely, utterly closed, and they both knew it. The evening conversations stopped, and the shared proximity, the quiet gravitational pull that had developed over months of treatment runs and late kitchens and two people slowly learning the weight of each other, stopped. She was in the penthouse, and she was nowhere in it. She answered when spoken to. She completed every task. She did not give him a single thing to hold. By day 3, Marcus appeared beside her while she was folding laundry. "Mr. Raso asked whether you seemed unwell?" He said it to the wall. "I told him you seemed fine." She kept folding. "I am fine." Marcus nodded and left, clearly relieved to have completed his assignment. Dominic attempted conversation 3 times in 4 days. Once about the weather, which was so unlike him she almost broke. Once about a news item she had left on the counter, a test, she understood, disguised as small talk. Once, or on day 5, simply her name in the hallway outside her door, Camille, in a tone she had never heard from him before and filed carefully away and did not respond to. She was not proud of any of this. She was also not ready to stop. Day 7. She had been to her mother's on the south side. 3 hours of sweet tea and careful questions she deflected with practiced ease. She came home with her scarf still on and her bag over one shoulder, and she was reaching up to unwrap the scarf when she heard it. A crash, a chair scraping hard across floor. Then his voice from the dining room, low, strange, wrong in a way that moved through her before she had finished processing it. "Camille, something's wrong." She dropped everything and ran. He was on the floor beside the dining table, one hand pressed flat against his chest, breathing in short, shallow pulls. The chair knocked over behind him. Her heart stopped. She dropped to her knees and grabbed his arm with both hands. "Where does it hurt? Look at me, Dominic. Look at me. I'm calling Dr. Park." She was already reaching for her phone, already calculating the fastest route to Northwestern, already somewhere past fear and into the specific cold efficiency of emergency. She looked at his face. There was no pain in his eyes. None. His breathing had already settled. The hand on his chest had relaxed. He was looking at her with an expression that was, if she was reading it correctly, something close to sheepish. She went very still. "Dominic." Slowly, precisely. He had the grace to say nothing. "You faked it." A pause. "I needed your attention." She tried to pull away. His hand closed around her wrist. Not hard, just present, uncertain. She stopped. "I'm sorry." All the performance gone. Voice stripped to something underneath it that she had never heard before, and that stopped her the way almost nothing else could. "I'm sorry for the prognosis. I'm sorry for shutting you out. I'm sorry for—" He stopped. Started again. "I hate the distance. I don't know when you became the person I want to come home to, but you are. And I cannot be in this house with you looking through me like I'm not worth seeing." She was still on the floor. Her wrist was still in his hand. He pulled her in. Right there. Cold floor, knocked over chair, city indifferent beyond the windows. He pulled her in and held her with the particular grip of a man who is afraid that if he loosens it even slightly, the thing he's holding will stand up and leave. She pressed her face against his chest. She could feel his heartbeat, real, present, slightly too fast. She let him hold her. She held him back. Later on the couch, the city gone dark outside and neither of them having moved toward the lamps, he said, "I think I have been falling for you since before I knew what was happening." She was quiet for a moment. The city hummed. Somewhere below, Chicago continued its business, indifferent and bright. "I have loved you for 3 years," she said. since I saw you eating cold pasta alone at midnight and thought, who in this whole city takes care of you? She looked at her hands. I never intended to say that out loud. He went very still beside her. Then he turned. He took her face in both hands, carefully, yet like something he was terrified of handling wrong, and kissed her with everything that had been building since the hospital folder on the desk, the car rides to Northwestern, the infusion chair, the floor, all of it. The contract, somewhere in the filing cabinet down the hall, stopped mattering entirely. The pregnancy moved the way important things move, not in dramatic leaps, but in the accumulation of small, ordinary moments that only reveal their weight in retrospect. Dominic at every appointment, tablet closed for once, asking questions the doctors visibly did not expect from a man who looked like him. Marcus appearing beside Camille in parking lots, grocery runs, the lobby of Northwestern, with the quiet inevitability of a man who had been instructed and had also, separately, decided. In one of the younger soldiers, barely 22, Southside himself, who had never once spoken directly to her, started leaving fruit on the kitchen counter every morning. Nectarines mostly, sometimes mangoes, never with a note, never with explanation. She ate the fruit, said gracias one morning without thinking. He looked like she had handed him the entire sky. October arrived, and with it the unfinished coffee. Dominic had always finished his coffee. 1 cup black every morning to the last drop. She had never once in 3 years poured out an unfinished cup of his. It was a small thing, the kind of thing only someone who had been paying attention for 3 years would notice. She noticed. She watched him set it aside on a Tuesday morning, half done, and say nothing and move on to his documents as if nothing had changed. She said nothing either. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and breathed deliberately, in, out, for several minutes. Then she got up and kept going because that was what you did. November. Dr. Park's office, both of them this time, and the words that landed like stones dropped from a height. The treatment was no longer holding. The progression had outpaced the projections. Continued intervention could slow things, perhaps, but the direction had been decided by something beyond intervention. Months, not years. She held Dominic's hand through the appointment and did not cry. December. He told her he was stopping the chemo over dinner. She was 7 months pregnant. She set down her fork and looked at him across the table and felt the anger arrive first, hot and immediate, and then the grief right behind it. And then cutting through both like cold air through an open window, understanding. You should have told me before you decided, she said. Not after. You're right. He set down his own fork. I keep trying to protect you from things you have every right to know. It is the only way I know how to love someone. A pause. I am trying to unlearn it. She looked at him for a long moment. Don't stop trying, she said. Their son arrived on a Wednesday in January, in the early hours when the city was at its quietest. Dominic did not leave her side for the 17 hours preceding it. When they placed the baby in his arms, she watched it happen. The thing she had seen only glimpses of before, the face beneath the face. His jaw tightened, his throat moved. He looked up at her with eyes that were very bright and said, then in a voice she had never heard from him before and would never forget, He's here. He's here, she confirmed. They named him Remy. 4 months. Dominic learned the particular weight of his son, the specific way Remy settled against a shoulder, the sounds he made before sleep versus the sounds he made simply observing the world with his father's absolute attention. He sat in the low light of the nursery at 3 a.m. more nights than not, holding something he knew was temporary, and choosing, every night, to hold on anyway. Marcus told her about the recordings on a Thursday afternoon, quietly in the hallway, with the careful voice of a man carrying something too heavy to carry alone. Dominic had been recording messages, for birthdays, for graduations. But for the ordinary hard days when a boy might need to hear his father's voice, and his father would not be there to provide it in person. She did not ask Dominic about it. She understood. Some things you do not need to discuss to honor. He passed on a February morning. The light through the gap in the curtains was that particular gray-pink color that Chicago produces in winter. The color she had come to associate with this city, this life, this man. She had not left his side in 3 days. Remy was with her mother on the south side. He was not afraid. She knew this the way she knew everything about him now, completely, fluently, in her bones. What she saw in those last hours was not fear. It was something quieter and more complete. A man who had spent 31 years building walls high enough to keep the world at a safe distance. If finally, in the last hours of his life, letting it be close. She held his hand. She told him she loved him. She told him Remy would know him, every story, every detail, every true piece of who his father was. She would make sure of it. She told him he had been seen. From the very beginning, from the hallway shadows and the cold pasta and the window and the floor. He had been seen by the one person he had never thought to look at. He did not speak. He had not spoken in hours. But his hand tightened around hers once, and then it was still. 5 years later. Camille stood at the stove in the kitchen of her South Side brownstone, the one Dominic had bought in her name in the neighborhood she had chosen, 3 blocks from where she grew up, making pasta at midnight. The same pasta, the same hour. And the way he used to eat it alone before she came along and ruined his solitude by loving him. Small feet on the hardwood behind her. Mama. Remy appeared in the doorway in his pajamas, hair in 4 directions, his father's eyes moving over the kitchen with his father's complete attention. Who are you making that for? She looked at him for a moment. For us? She said. Come sit. He climbed onto the stool beside the counter and watched the pot with the particular seriousness she would spend the rest of her life recognizing in new places, at school recitals, on soccer fields, across dinner tables for the next 20 years. The seriousness of a man she had loved who was gone, and also, somehow, entirely present. Tell me about Daddy, he said. Not a question. A standing request. She had been answering it since he was old enough to ask. She kept stirring. He was the most guarded man I have ever known. She chose her words the way she always did. Carefully, honestly, without simplifying. He kept the world at a distance because he had learned that things you love can leave. But underneath all of that, underneath all the walls and the silence and the way he could make a room go still just by walking into it, he was the softest person in it. He just needed someone patient enough to stay until he believed it was safe to show it. Remy considered this with great seriousness. Were you patient? I tried to be. Did he know you loved him? She was quiet. Outside, Chicago moved through the night, indifferent and alive and endlessly, mercilessly continuing, the way cities do, the way life does, even after the people who made it meaningful are gone. In the end, she said, yes, he knew. Her son leaned against her arm, small, warm, entirely, undeniably real. Then we both still have him, he said, with the certainty of a 5-year-old who has not yet learned to doubt the things that matter most. He's in both of us. Camille set down the spoon. She pulled her son close, tighter than the moment required, her face in his hair, breathing him in, and held on the way you hold things you know are precious and temporary and yours. Some love stories do not end. They change shape. They move through grief and come out the other side as something quieter and more permanent. They live in the eyes of a 5-year-old boy on a kitchen stool at midnight, watching his mother cook the meal that means home. They live in the particular way he tilts his head when he is thinking, in the stillness that comes over him before he speaks. and in every small place where a man who is gone has left himself behind in someone who is still becoming. They live in the space between what was lost and what remains. They live. If this story found you, if Dominic and Camille stayed with you the way they stayed with us, please like this video right now and leave us one word in the comments that describes how you feel at the end of this. Just one word. We read every single one. Share this with someone who needs a love story that doesn't look away from the hard parts. And subscribe so you never miss what we create next. We made this one for you. Thank you for staying until the very last word.